So at Chartbeat, you have the Engaged Time metric. What does that involve and what spurred its development?
So what Engaged Time does is gives you an incredibly accurate understanding of not just the time that a page is open or anything like that, but the amount of actual attention that you're getting on any particular piece of content or on any particular piece, a part of that content, in fact. And we do that by taking any number of signals from the kind of human-computer interactions you do to the pixels that are in view and so forth to infer when you're looking at the screen, when you're not looking at the screen. And that gives us a very, very accurate idea of what you're actually doing with the content. And that came from this general frustration with the idea that we were telling everyone as an industry, as an analytics industry, we were telling everyone that we were measuring content, but really we were simply measuring the link to the content.
Interesting.
We were measuring page views, and whether the content was read or not, whether people liked it or not, that really made no difference. And so I wanted to be able to say, could we do some simplistic, incomplete, but still better metric to understand when you got someone to the page, did they actually like it? Did they stick around long enough to give a crap?
Right. Do you feel like online ad space will be replaced by the notion of time? Will we evolve towards something closer to like a broadcast mechanism?
If it doesn't, we're probably kind of screwed. The problem that we have right now by having a kind of the click web and using all advertising. So let me be clear, for direct response advertising, things like click-through rates and so forth are fine. Google's proven they've built a very good business on top of that. For brand advertising, where you want to communicate a message to an audience, then using those kind of metrics has been incredibly bad for us because we created a world of infinite inventory where the marginal cost of additional inventory is effectively zero. And in those kind of conditions, prices always drop to zero. So the interesting thing about time is twofold. For brands, it gives them exactly what they want. You want the time of that audience, you want their attention to communicate your message. And for publishers, it gives them a unit of scarcity. There's only 24 hours in a day, and that's not going to increase anytime soon. So the more of that unit of scarcity you have, the more you should be able to charge. So that's why publishers are kind of exploring this and actually thinking about, is this a new model and a new better way for sustainable publishing in the future?
What's your take on all the social share numbers that are out there? The tweets, the likes, are those kind of a modern equivalent of hits, or do you think that there's some value there?
I think so when we think about it, we think about implicit measures of behavior and explicit measures of behavior. Things like the amount of attention that you get is an implicit, broad, universal measure of behavior. Social shares are an interesting explicit measure of behavior. The one thing we should do, though, is not extrapolate too far from what they're saying. There's actually zero correlation between the amount of social sharing around an article and the amount of actual attention it accrues, the average amount of attention it accrues. And so when people are saying, oh my God, you know what, people must have really loved my article, they must have read it all because of all the social shares it got. That's not necessarily true. So social sharing and measuring social sharing is a great way of understanding social sharing. It's not a great way of understanding attention or anything else.
Right, take a look at a scroll map and you'll start to feel real bad about your content, right?
Yeah, that can do it.
Right. Are there particular analytics terms or concepts that just make you cringe?
Well, I think it's maybe not the terms that make me cringe. I mean, the classic one for me is still the old time spent, because the way traditional time spent has been measured was that you had a page load and you got a timestamp, and then you hoped like hell that someone would go onto a subsequent page where you would get a second timestamp, and then you would count between the two. So this leads to situations where there was a CRO of a very large publishing operation saying, on our native advertising, we're getting like 6 or 7 minutes of engagement. I'm like, you've got like a 600-word piece on that thing. Average reading speed is about 250 to 300 words a minute. You're saying your audience is at least 3 times slower than the average.
Right.
Is that going in your sales decks?
Right.
So there's things like that where I'm just like, you know it's not true, and yet you keep saying it.
Yeah. If you say it enough, maybe somebody will believe it, I guess, right? What do you see happen? Well, this is a twofold question. What do you hope to see happening in the analytics space in the next 18 months? And what do you think will happen in the analytics space in the next 18 months?
What I hope to have happen is that we actually try to use metrics that better align with our actual goals and be very realistic about what those goals are, rather than using proxies that are inadequate. What I think will happen is that you'll see some small changes among the innovators moving to that, but Newton's first law of motion is still very much the way things go in the media business, which is inertia rules. So it's going to be a very long, very hard process, but I think you'll start to see some seeds of real momentum beginning in the next year and 18 months.
Do you feel like the trajectory of this is headed in the right direction and that eventually we'll get there? It's just going to take a long time, or are you apprehensive about the adoption actually happening?
I think it's actually, if you'd asked me 6 months ago, I'd have been much more skeptical than I am today. What you've seen is a confluence of a few different things happening. You've had the kind of advertising world come together around this idea of viewability finally after 6 years of fighting about it. And as soon as that happened, as soon as there was a standard which said 1 second, 50% of the ad has to be in view for 1 second, suddenly people were saying, well, that's kind of crappy. I want more than that. I want better than viewability. Because we'd for the first time said there's a quantitative difference between 2 ad placements on a page. So that was interesting. And you've also seen this increased desire for trust and transparency. You saw Group M, which is the largest buying agency in the world, say they're no longer buying on exchanges because they just don't trust them. So all of these things suggest that there is a greater desire for buying things that you can actually trust are true. And so being able to say, you know what, if I can accurately measure that I got my ad or my native advertising or whatever it is in front of someone for a sufficient quantity of time, that's a good thing, because that's also one of the only 2 things that actually correlates to recall and recognition, the other being good creative. Who knew?
Last question for you. What people or projects are you tracking these days?
So I'm really interested in what Upworthy is doing, what Medium are trying to do, in trying to thinking about new metrics and so forth. I'm also interested in what people like Say Media and what Vox are trying to do in terms of new ad formats. And it's interesting to see people also going down the kind of direct-to-consumer route with kind of paywalls and so forth. You're seeing major challenges with those being scalable across a broad range, but I think it's fascinating to see this idea that we will monetize in a variety of ways, and it's not just going to be advertising carrying the weight across the board. I think that's a hopeful future.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.